I'm here with Avik Roy. He's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributor here at Forbes. And he's just published a really interesting report about the FDA and about whether the FDA is setting too high a bar in what clinical trials need to be conducted for drugs to reach the market. Avik, what did you find?
Matt, so the main finding of the paper is that if you think about clinical trial costs in general, which you've written a lot of great stuff about how the costs are growing and growing and growing, it turns out that the biggest driver of those costs is phase 3 trials. Phase 3 trials end up costing 90% or incurring about 90% of the overall cost of clinical drug development. That is to say, the degree to which drugs are studied in humans as opposed to animals or labs. Those studies in humans, 90% of the costs are in phase 3, these late stage trials. So really trying to figure out how to optimize the utilization of those late stage phase 3 trials is really the biggest way, the best, most efficient way to the 80-20, so to speak,
right,
of reducing the cost of drug development.
So how would you propose that the FDA do this? I mean, what should the FDA change?
Well, we already have an example in HIV and cancer and some of these other life-threatening diseases of a process the FDA has used called the accelerated approval process, where if a drug shows promising safety and effectiveness after phase 2, they'll get a kind of conditional or a tentative approval through the accelerated approval process. And they still have to do the phase 3 trials to show that the drug actually works as advertised, and the FDA can then pull the drug later if that turns out to show that the drug isn't as good as advertised. But that process is only available today for serious life-threatening conditions. And what I'm advocating is let's expand that. There are a lot of areas like diabetes, heart disease, these chronic diseases that affect hundreds of millions of people that we don't see a lot of drug development for those areas as much as we should because it's so cost prohibitive.
I like the idea, but I mean, one obvious problem with accelerated approvals, we had a case recently in Avastin for breast cancer where the phase 3 trials did not work out to the FDA's satisfaction and FDA decided to rescind an approval, which doesn't even necessarily rescind use for that drug. So it's not even the most extreme example. It's not like that's the only thing Avastin's approved for. And people went ballistic. I mean, are we really ready as a society to deal with drugs that have halfway approvals?
Well, I think the Avastin breast cancer example is a great one. I'm really glad you brought it up, Matt, because to me, that's the system worked in that case. The drug got on the market based on mid-stage phase 2 promising data, and then when the phase 3 data showed that the drug didn't really have a survival benefit in breast cancer, the FDA revoked the approval. Doctors can prescribe it off-label, to your point, so if people really, really want to use Avastin breast cancer, they can, but insurers don't have to pay for it. The FDA said, look, we don't think the data supports survival benefit in that indication. That's fine. That's how it should be. And yes, there is a political outcry, but see, that's a good thing. Right now, the way it works is if the FDA approves a drug early and then there's a safety issue later, like with Vioxx, there's a huge public outcry. But there's no public outcry when the FDA stalls a drug or a drug never gets developed or never makes it to market because the FDA kind of drags it out or raises the bar too high. This way, the political outcry is more equal, and that helps the incentives for the FDA to be aligned in the right way.
That's an interesting idea, but do you think that for some of these indications, for cardiovascular disease, which I've covered a lot, one of the reasons the trials are so big is because in order to prove that you have an advantage in some of these cardiovascular drugs, you need to do giant trials. So the companies decide to do them. I mean, what would a halfway point look like, especially if you're doing something like an artery inflammation drug, like GlaxoSmithKline and Human Genome Sciences are developing, where you really have no idea if that thing works until it's gone through a 30,000 patient trial. You just don't know.
Yeah, I think there are going to be cases, even if an accelerated or conditional approval process was expanded for all indications or all diseases, you're going to have situations where there's really no surrogate marker or no early signal of a drug's efficacy, and you're going to still have to do the 30,000 patient trials. And maybe that's one example. Maybe daraplatin is one example, the GlaxoSmithKline drug. But there are going to be other examples where maybe you do have an indicator. So, one could imagine a great drug for lowering cholesterol that shows a really promising benefit in terms of lowering your LDL cholesterol. But until they do the 30,000 patient study showing that they reduce heart attack rates at the same level as
I'm glad you said that,
Lipitor.
Avik, because that drug is actually on the market, and it's called Zetia. you know, great profile when added to a statin for lowering cholesterol, and originally sold great until the first, not even an outcomes trial, kind of a little tiny imaging trial came out, but showed negative results, and sales of particularly the combination of Vytorin just cratered. But I wonder, looking at that example, whether that situation was actually better than what you're proposing, because in your scenario, the company might have gotten some kind of conditional approval, which would have always led people not to use the drug. They may have made more money off the system as it is.
Well, you know, I think that if you have more situations, or more, if you take the Vytorin example, the Zeti example, and say, okay, let's say you have this sort of accelerated approval or conditional approval where, based on LDL reduction, low-density lipoprotein cholesterol reduction, you get the drug on the market, and you fund the large outcome studies, the 30,000 patient studies.
Right.
But because the drug's on the market in a very narrow patient population, they can fund the phase 3 trial. It's really about the sequence. So you're right that in that particular case, maybe they generated more revenues because of the way it played out. But if you think about, if you're CEO of a biotech company or a new drug company today, and you're trying to say, you know what, I really want to attack high cholesterol. That's the disease area I want to target. And you have the ability to say, you know what, I know I can generate some revenues, some maybe $200 million revenues,
Right,
if I get approved for just lowering LDL. And it's such a huge market, the $200 million is nothing. But that revenue can then fund your phase 3 trials. It
2
totally
years of
changes the
$200
risk.
million of revenue, and you're profitable and funding a giant outcome study.
Exactly. And if you can do that, then all of a sudden, think about all the venture capital, all the investment that can go into drug development, because all of a sudden you're not saying, I have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on 30,000 patient clinical trials and then go bankrupt if it doesn't work out. You can, the risk reward, you can spend $50 million or $100 million, which is a lot less, and venture capitalists and other investors are much more likely to plow money to that field if the risk reward is more favorable.
Right. Well, I mean, you mentioned before we were talking the example of Portola Pharmaceuticals, where they have one of these great new blood thinners, the factor 10s, but they were partnered with Merck and fell behind everybody else. And now they're kind of stuck, the partnership with Merck ended, and they're stuck trying to find some niche for themselves. And how do they stay in business? So I think that's a very good example. But isn't really a lot of the problem here the time spent and the, I mean, wouldn't we be better off both for, wouldn't industry be more motivated by adding more time to the back end of these drugs' lives than to the front? I mean, if you're doing a 30,000 patient trial, maybe instead of getting to market earlier in some small indication, I mean, if I were a pharma, I'd much rather get more time at the end, you know, extend the patent life so that, and then the fact that I'm doing this huge study matters less. The risk makes more sense.
That could be, and I think, you know, if you make this process voluntary, where the companies actually have to apply for conditional approval, and you know, they can choose either path. They could choose the traditional path, or they could choose the more accelerated path of using phase 2 data. And large companies like a GlaxoSmithKline, which has a lot of money, they might say, you know what, we got a lot of cash. We'd rather throw for the fences or shoot for the fences. Let's invest all that money. But a smaller company that's more entrepreneurial, that may not, like a Portola, they might prefer a path that gets them to market sooner because they can develop revenues and build things from there.
So, but isn't this actually? How does this impact the payer system? Because I mean, look, the most efficient way to have a system where you have an easier level approval but less use is a single payer system, right? Where, like some of the European systems, where you have these two hurdles, and you've really got to get over both of them to get significant sales, but you can kind of get in this netherworld. With our payer system, would this work with the widespread, with all these different insurance companies all wanting to kind of cover everything?
Well, I think it would actually. If you look at the practices of the insurers, private sector insurers in America when it comes to drugs, they're pretty good about requiring you to start off with the cheap generic drugs first, the older drugs first, before going to the fancy new expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in this situation, that's exactly what would happen, right? So Portola,
they would add another tier, you think?
Yeah, you know, you'd be required to start on warfarin, which is the generic drug that's been around for 50 years or 80 years. Then, if you fail that, or if you're ineligible for that, you're going to go on.
You've got to try Xarelto or Eliquis.
Yeah, Xarelto, and then if you fail that for some reason, or maybe you have a side effect on that drug, and there's a niche there for the Portola drug, say, then you'd go on that drug. So the companies, the insurers are very good at kind of making you sequence therapy according to value and
if
data
the FDA actually put the sequence in the label, they would certainly adhere to it because it makes cost sense for them.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you see that with the Avastin breast situation, right? So the private insurers are not, Medicare is still reimbursing for Avastin and breast cancer, but the private insurers are not, and that's one of the reasons why the sales of Avastin breast cancer have cratered.
And how do we control pricing here? Because the fear with this kind of regulation change is always that you get like a KP Pharmaceuticals situation, right? Where you get one company that has this, I mean, these are obviously going to be niche markets. We don't want these priced like niche market drugs. You know, this isn't like Kalydeco for CF where you have real clinical outcome. There's a proof fast real clinical outcome and they can charge $300,000 a year. We don't want that new blood thinner to be that much more expensive here, do we? There is a pricing concern.
Yeah, and I think again that's the insurers do play a role in that. If you look at, for example, the launch of Human Genome's Benlysta for lupus, that was the first new drug for lupus approved in 50, 60 years. They still couldn't price it at $300,000 because the insurers would say, you know what, we can give them generic steroids, so there is an alternative.
They still may have overpriced it given the uptake.
It's conceivable. So there is still an ability. I mean, insurers have a lot more leverage than we think. I think where insurers have had a lot tougher time is in oncology. So if you have a drug for cancer, or some really rare disease that's, you know, a kid's genetic disorder or something like that, those areas that are maybe so politically sympathetic, the patients that are very politically sympathetic, that's where the insurers have a tough time pushing back, because then they're painted as the bad guy for not reimbursing for the drug. And companies, the pharmaceutical companies, have exploited that to a degree.
Well, to a degree. I mean, we have something like 10 or 11 drugs that cost more than $200,000 a year.
Right, but we still see, particularly on, you know, with small molecule drugs, when they go off patent, the insurers do try to stage, you know, try to say, look,
Not only that, there's a lot more competition in crowded categories than people think. I mean,
absolutely.
Nexium sold at some huge discount.
Completely agree.
All right, well, thank you very much, Avik.
Great
really
talking
appreciate
to you,
coming by.
Absolutely.